I drive a 10-year-old Ford F-150 with a cracked dashboard and a pine tree air freshener that stopped smelling like anything about 4 years ago. I am 63 years old. I live alone in a 2-bedroom house in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and I have never in my entire life had a child. So when my phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon in March and a woman said, "Is this Mr. Alderton? Mr. Frank Alderton?" I said yes, because that is my name. And she said, "Sir, this is the front office at Crestwood Elementary School. We have a situation here, and we need you to come in as soon as possible." I told her she had the wrong person. She said, "Sir, are you Frank Joseph Alderton, born February 14, 1961, currently residing at 42012 Birchwood Lane?" I said yes to all of that. She said, "Then we need you here, now." I drove to that school the way you drive when you don't understand what's happening, slowly, carefully, like the road itself might give you an answer if you pay close enough attention. It was 20 minutes from my house. I remember a country station was on the radio, and I turned it off halfway there because I couldn't process the music and the confusion at the same time. The front office smelled like construction paper and hand sanitizer. There was a woman behind the desk with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a look on her face like she had been holding her breath, and she called me. Beside her, in one of those small plastic chairs that exist only in elementary schools, sat a little girl. She was maybe 7 or 8. She had red-brown hair pulled into 2 uneven pigtails. She was wearing a purple jacket with a yellow star on the pocket. She was holding a backpack in her lap with both hands, very still, the way children sit when they are trying very hard to be good. She looked up when I walked in. She looked at me for about 3 seconds. And then she got out of that chair, walked straight across the office, wrapped both arms around my waist, and said into my coat, "Grandpa, you came." I did not move for a moment. I looked at the woman behind the desk. The woman behind the desk looked back at me with an expression that said she was just as lost as I was. I put my hands gently on the little girl's shoulders and crouched down so I was at her level. Her eyes were gray-green. She had a small scar above her left eyebrow, barely visible. She was looking at me like I was something she had been waiting for. I said, "Sweetheart, I think there might be a mix-up. What's your name?" She said, "Ivy. You know my name." I said, "Ivy, I don't think I'm who you think I am." She tilted her head slightly. "You're my grandpa, Frank." The woman behind the desk cleared her throat. She told me that Ivy's emergency contact card listed only one name, Frank Joseph Alderton, with my address and my phone number. That I was listed as grandfather. That Ivy's mother had not come to pick her up at 3 o'clock, and by 5:30 they had called me because I was the only contact they had. I stood up slowly. My knees do that thing now where they announce themselves every time I stand. I said, "Who is Ivy's mother?" The woman said the name quietly. "A woman named Celeste Alderton." I stood there in that elementary school office with the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and I tried to remember every Celeste I had ever known in 63 years of living. There was only one. I need to back up about 35 years. In 1989, I was 28 years old and working at a machine shop in Nashville. I was not a sophisticated man. I was not a complicated man. I liked football, and I liked working with my hands, and I was, if I'm honest, not someone who thought very carefully about the future. I dated a woman named Celeste for about 8 months. She was 24. She had a laugh that you could hear from the other side of a parking lot. She was studying to be a dental hygienist, and she had opinions about everything, strongly held, delivered at full volume. I liked her a lot. I think I might have loved her in the blunt, unexamined way I loved things back then. We broke up in the spring. It wasn't dramatic. She wanted to move to Atlanta for a program she'd been accepted to. I didn't want to leave Nashville. That was the whole of it. We said goodbye, and I thought about her sometimes, and then I thought about her less, and eventually I thought about her only rarely, the way you think about a meal you had at a restaurant that closed down. I got married in 1994 to a woman I'll call my wife because that's what she was for, 19 years. We didn't have children, not for lack of trying. That's all I'll say about that. We divorced in 2013. It was quiet and sad, and we are still technically on speaking terms if you count exchanging Christmas cards as speaking. After the divorce, I moved to Murfreesboro. I retired from the machine shop at 61 when my right shoulder finally decided it was done. I have a small pension, a vegetable garden in the backyard that produces more zucchini than any one man can eat, and a dog named Hector who is 12 years old and sleeps approximately 22 hours a day. That is the whole of my life. No children, no grandchildren. I am Frank Joseph Alderton, and I am 63 years old, and until that Tuesday in March, I was certain I knew exactly who I was. The school couldn't release Ivy to me that night. That's the correct policy. I want to be clear about that. They did everything right. A supervisor came out and explained that they had already contacted Child Protective Services because a child had been uncollected for nearly 3 hours. A caseworker was on her way. They asked if I would stay until she arrived, which I did, sitting in a plastic chair with Ivy sitting next to me, showing me the drawings in her sketchbook. She drew horses almost exclusively, detailed horses with careful manes and small hooves. She acted like she knew me. She talked to me the way children talk to people they are completely comfortable with, interrupting herself, backtracking, laughing at things that weren't funny, showing me the same drawing twice. At one point, she leaned against my arm and I didn't move away. The caseworker arrived. Her name was Miss Tran, and she had a calm, practiced manner that I imagine you develop when you do that job long enough. She took me to a separate room and asked me questions for about 40 minutes. I told her everything I've just told you. She listened without reacting, which was either reassuring or unsettling. I couldn't decide which. She said she was going to try to reach Ivy's mother. She asked if I would be available by phone. I drove home. I fed Hector. I sat at my kitchen table and I did not turn on the television. Celeste Alderton. She had taken my last name, apparently, or given it to her daughter. I did not know which. I did not know anything. My phone rang at 9:47 that night. It was Miss Tran. She told me that Celeste had been in an accident on I-24 that afternoon. She had been transported to Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Her condition was serious. She was in surgery. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "Is Ivy okay? Where is she tonight?" Miss Tran said Ivy was in emergency foster placement for the night. She asked if I had any relationship to the child. I said I didn't know. She said she understood. She said that if I was willing, she could arrange for me to visit Celeste at the hospital tomorrow, that it might help clarify things. I said I'd be there. Vanderbilt is a big hospital. I've been there before, when my wife had her appendix out in 2007, but I always find myself slightly lost in hospitals, the way you're slightly lost in airports, even when you know where you're going. I found the right floor. I told the desk I was there to see Celeste Alderton. The nurse looked up her name and then looked at me and said she'd need to check. I waited. A doctor came out, middle-aged woman with dark hair and a tired expression. She told me Celeste had come through surgery. She had significant injuries, several broken ribs, a punctured lung, a fractured pelvis, but she was stable. She was sedated. She would not be able to have visitors for at least another day, possibly two. The doctor said, "Are you family?" I said I wasn't sure. She looked at me in the way that doctors sometimes look at you when they've heard everything and are no longer surprised by anything. I asked if there was anyone else listed on her contact information. The doctor said there was no one else, that Celeste had been admitted alone, that as far as the hospital records showed, her next of kin field was blank. I drove home. I sat in the driveway for a few minutes. Hector was watching me from the window. That night, I went through every box in my house looking for anything from 1989. I found a shoebox in the back of the bedroom closet with old photographs. I found one of Celeste and me at a cookout, standing in front of somebody's truck. She was squinting into the sun and laughing. I was holding a can of Budweiser and looking at her instead of the camera. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at that photograph for a long time. On Thursday, Miss Tran called again. She said Celeste was awake and alert, but still in significant pain and not able to have long conversations. She said Celeste had asked about Ivy immediately upon waking, which Miss Tran said was a good sign. She also said that Celeste had asked, specifically, whether Frank had been called. That's when I knew it wasn't a mistake. Celeste knew who I was. She had put my name and my number on her daughter's emergency contact card deliberately. She had given her daughter my last name. This was not a clerical error. This was not a coincidence. I asked Miss Tran point blank, was Ivy my granddaughter? Miss Tran said she couldn't answer that. She said that was a conversation I would need to have with Celeste when Celeste was able to have it. I visited on Saturday. She was in a room with a window facing a parking garage. She had tubes in her arm and a brace around her midsection, and her face was bruised on the left side. She was thinner than I remembered, which was to be expected. 35 years will do that, but she had the same eyes. Dark, direct, not inclined to look away from things. She looked at me when I walked in. She didn't seem surprised to see me. She said, Frank. I said, hey, Celeste. There was a silence. Not an uncomfortable one exactly. More like the silence before something that needs to be said gets said. She said, I should have called you. I know that. I sat down in the chair beside her bed. I said, tell me. She talked for a long time, slower than I remembered her talking, pausing when the pain got in the way. Here is what she told me. After we broke up in 1989, she moved to Atlanta. She enrolled in her program. A few months after she arrived, she found out she was pregnant. She ran the dates. She was certain the baby was mine. She thought about calling me. She picked up the phone more than once. She put it down. She told herself she would call later. Later became next week. Next week became next month. She had the baby. A girl, she named her Diane, and she told herself she would call when things settled down, when she had her bearings, when she was ready. She never called. She raised Diane alone. Diane grew up and eventually had Ivy, also alone, the father not in the picture. Diane died 14 months ago. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed late. She was 33 years old. Celeste paused when she said that. She looked at the window. She had been raising Ivy since then. She had done all right. She had her work. She'd been a dental hygienist for 28 years, eventually opened a small practice. She had a house in Smyrna, about 12 miles from where I live now, which I did not know. She had put my name on Ivy's emergency contact card after Diane died because Ivy was her only family left and she didn't know what would happen if something happened to her. She had not called me to tell me any of this. I asked her why. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, I didn't know how to start that conversation. And then so much time had passed that it felt impossible. And then I thought, what right do I have to walk into your life after all this time with all of this? I didn't say anything to that. I'm not sure I had the right words. She said, I'm sorry, Frank. I know that doesn't cover it. I'm just sorry. I looked at my hands. I said, I have a granddaughter. She said, you have a granddaughter. I was quiet for a while. Then I said, what does Ivy know? Celeste said that Ivy knew her grandfather was named Frank, that he lived nearby, and that someday she would meet him. That was all she knew. I thought about that little girl in the plastic chair with her horse drawings. She'd looked at me like she already knew. Here is where I want to be careful, because I know how this kind of story can sound, and I don't want to make it sound easier than it was. I drove home from that hospital very angry, not at Ivy, who had done nothing, not even entirely at Celeste, who had made a human mistake and spent 35 years living with it, angry at the absence, at the 33 years I'd had a daughter I never knew, at the woman named Diane, who had grown up without knowing her father existed, at the fact that she had died at 33 years old and I had not known she was alive, let alone that she was gone. That is a loss you can't fully process in a car ride. It's probably a loss you can't fully process at all. You just carry it. I got home. I fed Hector. He put his old gray head in my lap and I sat with him on the kitchen floor for about 20 minutes, which is not something I do regularly and which he seemed to find acceptable. Then I called Miss Tran. I asked what would happen to Ivy if Celeste's recovery was extended. Miss Tran explained the options: temporary foster care while Celeste recovered, or if a family member was willing and approved, kinship placement. I said I wanted to start the process for kinship placement. Miss Tran was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mr. Alderton, I want to make sure you understand that this is a significant commitment. The process isn't quick, and caring for a child of Ivy's age is." I said, "I understand. I want to start the process." It took 3 weeks for the preliminary approval to come true. Home visits, background checks, interviews, paperwork, a considerable amount of paperwork. I am not a paperwork person. My neighbor across the street, a retired schoolteacher named Ms. Patterson, who has appointed herself the general supervisor of the whole neighborhood, helped me organize everything on my kitchen table one Sunday afternoon and told me I needed a filing system, which I did not argue with. Ivy came to stay with me on a Thursday afternoon in April. She arrived with a caseworker, a pink rolling suitcase, a backpack, and the stuffed rabbit she'd had in her lap that first day in the school office. I had made up the second bedroom. I'd bought a comforter with small yellow flowers on it because I didn't know what she liked yet and yellow seemed safe. I'd also bought a box of crayons and a sketchbook because I had noticed the horses. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked around for a moment. She said, "You got a sketchbook." I said, "I noticed you draw." She looked at me. Then she walked in, set the stuffed rabbit on the pillow, sat down cross-legged on the bed, and opened the sketchbook. She said, "I'm going to draw my horse first. Her name is Copper." I said, "Okay." She said, "You can watch if you want." I sat in the chair in the corner, and I watched her draw. Celeste came home from the hospital 6 weeks after the accident. She had a long recovery ahead of her. Physical therapy, limited mobility for several months. She was staying in her house in Smyrna with a home health aide coming 3 times a week. I brought Ivy to see her on a Sunday. I want to be honest, that first visit was hard. Celeste was glad to see Ivy. Ivy climbed carefully onto the bed beside her grandmother and showed her the horse drawings. There were 11 of them now, filling half the sketchbook. I sat in a chair by the window and watched them together. At some point, Celeste looked over Ivy's head at me. She looked like she was going to say something. I shook my head slightly. She nodded and looked back at Ivy. There's plenty of time for conversations later. That day, what mattered was Ivy. I want to tell you about the morning about 2 months after Ivy came to stay with me. It was a Saturday. I was in the backyard working on the vegetable garden, which had started producing its annual embarrassment of zucchini. Ivy was sitting on the porch steps watching me, which she did sometimes, not helping, just watching, in a quiet, companionable way that reminded me of a cat deciding whether it trusted you. She said, "Grandpa Frank?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Are you my real grandpa?" I stopped what I was doing. I wiped my hands on my jeans. I went and sat on the steps beside her. I said, "What do you mean by real?" She thought about this with the seriousness that 7-year-olds bring to questions they've been sitting with for a while. She said, Grandma told me I would meet you someday, but I didn't meet you until now, so I wondered if it counted. I said, Ivy, you came and found me in that school office. You recognized me. She said, I just knew it was you. I said, that counts in my book. She looked out at the garden for a moment. Hector was lying at the edge of the yard in his usual spot in the sun. She said, okay, and then she went back inside to get her sketchbook, and I went back to the zucchini, and that was the whole conversation. But I want you to understand what that conversation meant to me. I am 63 years old. I was married for 19 years, and we didn't have children. I have spent the last 10 years alone in a house that was always a little too quiet. I thought that was just going to be the shape of my life. And then a little girl in a purple jacket wrapped her arms around my waist in an elementary school office and called me Grandpa, like I was the most obvious thing in the world. I did not know I had a daughter. I did not get to know her. That grief sits in me, and I don't expect it to leave. But Ivy is here, and Ivy is real. And she draws horses with great concentration, and she tells me about Copper as though Copper is an actual horse who lives nearby, and she has decided that Hector is her dog too, which Hector seems cautiously willing to accept. Celeste and I have had the harder conversations now, more than once. They are not comfortable conversations, and I don't think they will ever be entirely comfortable. I am still angry in the way that is underneath everything else, not on the surface, not aimed at anyone in particular, just present. The kind of anger that becomes something you manage rather than something you solve. But I also understand that she was a young woman alone, that she was scared, that she made a decision and then couldn't find the door back out of it. I understand that without forgiving it fully, and I think that's where I have to stay for now. What I know is this. Ivy came to me. She walked across a room and held on. She did not hesitate. Children are not subtle about trust. They give it or they don't, and Ivy gave it to me from the first moment, before she had any reason to. I'm not going to let her down. There are things I cannot undo. 35 years is a long time. A whole life happened that I wasn't part of. A woman named Diane grew up and worked and got sick and died, and I never knew her name while she was living. I have to hold that. I will hold that for the rest of my life. But I bought a sketchbook with good paper because she told me the cheap kind bleeds when she uses markers. I drove her to school every morning for 3 weeks until she told me she wanted to ride the bus again, like a big kid. I went to a parent-teacher conference, my first and only parent-teacher conference at age 63, and the teacher told me Ivy was bright and a little quiet and very kind to the other kids. I said that sounded about right. I learned how to make macaroni and cheese the right way, which apparently does not involve the box. I sat on the bathroom floor for 40 minutes one night when she had a bad dream and couldn't go back to sleep, and we didn't talk much. We just sat, and eventually she fell asleep leaning against my arm, and I didn't move until I was sure she was down for the night. I am 63 years old, and I drive a 10-year-old truck, and my dog is 12, and my garden grows too much zucchini, and my house, for the first time in a very long time, is not too quiet. That's all I have to say about that. I think about Celeste a lot. Not the way I used to when she was just a memory from a cookout in 1989 and a photograph in a shoebox. I think about her now in a more complicated way. The way you think about a decision someone made that changed everything without either of you knowing it at the time. She made a choice to stay quiet. I understand the fear behind it. A young woman, alone, scared, telling herself she'd call next week, then next month, then next year, until the years became a life and the life became something she didn't know how to explain. I get that. I'm not sure I would have done differently at 24 with no map and no safety net. What I know is that silence has weight. It accumulates. And what starts as something you think you're protecting people from eventually becomes the thing that costs everyone the most. That's not a judgment, it's just what I've seen. What I keep coming back to is Ivy, 7 years old, sitting in a plastic chair in a school office, holding her backpack with both hands, waiting. She had been told she had a grandfather named Frank who lived nearby and that someday she would meet him. She didn't panic. She didn't fall apart. When I walked through that door, she looked at me for 3 seconds, decided something, and walked straight across the room. That kind of trust, that clear, uncalculating, open-handed trust, is something most adults have to work years to build back after the world has knocked it out of them. She still had it whole. I think about that a lot when I'm tempted to make things more complicated than they need to be. There's a version of this story where I walked out of that school office and called the lawyer and spent 6 months sorting out what was mine and what wasn't. A version where I let the anger win, where I decided that 35 years of absence was too much to bridge and I wasn't obligated to anyone. That version exists. I thought about it on the drive home from the hospital. I sat with it. But here's what I've learned, not from a book or a sermon, just from living long enough to see how things play out. The moments that define you are almost never the big dramatic ones. They're the small choices, made quietly, when nobody is watching. Do I call Miss Tran back? Do I start the paperwork? Do I buy a sketchbook with good paper because a little girl I barely know mentioned once that the cheap kind bleeds? I did. Not because I'm a particularly good man. I'm not. I'm a 63-year-old retired machinist with a bad shoulder, a geriatric dog, and too much zucchini. But I was smart enough to recognize what was standing in front of me, and I had just enough backbone to not walk away from it. Ivy asked me once if I thought things happened for a reason. I told her I wasn't sure, but I thought that people had a choice about what they did with the things that happened to them. She thought about that with the seriousness she brings to most things, then asked if she could have a snack. That sounded about right to me. The house isn't too quiet anymore. That's the whole of it.